That was the thing about Tuesday mornings. Not Monday. Monday had at least the structure of a beginning. Not Friday. Friday had the mercy of an ending. Tuesday was the truest day of the week for Ethan. Tuesday had no ceremony. It just was. The apartment was the same as it had been the Tuesday before, and the one before that. The kitchen light buzzed faintly above the counter. The coffee cooled in the mug. Outside, the city was already doing what cities do, grinding forward with the particular indifference that Ethan had once found thrilling and now found quietly exhausting. He was 34 years old. He had a job, a decent one, project coordinator at an architecture firm downtown. He made enough to cover rent, enough to eat, enough to put a little away. He had friends, though most of them had spread across the city in different directions, into marriages and renovations and pregnancies and promotions, into versions of life that always seemed to require a certain forward momentum that Ethan could observe but not explain in his own story. He had his faith. He still had that. He went to church on Sundays. He read his Bible, though not as regularly as he once had. He prayed, though he had stopped writing the prayers down because there was something unbearable about opening a journal from 2 years ago and reading the same request you were still making today. That was the thing nobody talked about, he thought. They talked about doubt as if it were a storm, as if losing faith looked like lightning and raised fists in an angry confrontation with the heavens. They talked about the prodigal son, about the man who turned away and ran, about dramatic departures and equally dramatic returns. But Ethan had never turned away. He had never shouted at God or torn a page from his Bible or stopped believing. He had simply grown quiet, like a dial turned down so gradually that you only notice the silence when you realize the music has been gone for a long time. He was still there. He was just still. I want you to sit with that word for a moment. Still. Because for Ethan, it had two meanings that had collapsed into each other somewhere along the way. He was still faithful, and he was still, not moving, not advancing, not becoming anything new. The prayers were still prayers. The attendance was still attendance. But somewhere underneath all the ritual and the language, underneath the Sunday handshakes and the highlighted verses and the notes he still sometimes took during sermons, somewhere underneath all of that, the living water had become, if not stagnant, then very, very quiet. He picked up his phone. 9 notifications, 3 emails, 2 news alerts, a birthday reminder for someone he barely knew, a weather update, a promotional message from a coffee subscription service he had forgotten to cancel. The city buzzed in his palm. He put the phone down, looked out the window. The light that morning had the quality of something unfinished, gray at the edges, pale at the center, not yet committed to becoming either a good day or a bad one. Ethan took a breath, got dressed, left the coffee on the counter, and walked into the same Tuesday he had walked into 100 times before. He had not always been this way. There is a version of Ethan from 8 years ago, from the summer he was 26, that I want you to meet, because it will help you understand what had been lost, or more precisely, what had gone quiet. That version of Ethan was the kind of young man who prayed on his lunch break, not performatively, not because anyone was watching, because there was a pressure in his chest during that season of his life that only released when he talked to God, and the relief was real enough that he kept coming back. He had graduated, found work, moved to the city with 2 suitcases, and an almost embarrassing amount of certainty that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. He had joined a church that first Sunday, not the closest one, but the one he had felt pulled toward, which was 3 bus stops farther and ran 15 minutes long and had a worship team that played one song for 11 minutes straight one evening. And he had stood there in the middle of that music with tears running down his face, not sad, just overwhelmed by the realness of it, by the sense that something greater than himself was present in the room. He prayed with specificity in those days. He had a little journal, dark blue, spiral bound, and he filled the pages with requests and gratitudes and questions, and sometimes just the names of people he was carrying. He prayed about his work, and his work grew. He prayed about his loneliness, and God sent friendships. He prayed about direction, and direction came. Not always the way he expected, but it came. Then at 28, he had prayed for a door to open in his career. a specific opportunity, the kind that felt like a natural next step, a senior role, a project with more responsibility, a chance to build something. He had prayed about it with that same clean, specific faith, had even written the date in his journal the day he submitted the application. He did not get the job. That was not in itself the problem. Disappointment was something he had learned to hold. He knew the theology. He trusted the Psalms. He believed that the plans of the Lord were better than his own. But then he prayed the same prayer again, a year later, for a different door. And that door also closed. And the year after that, a relationship he had believed was moving towards something lasting ended quietly, the way certain lights go out. Not dramatically, but simply and finally. And he prayed about that too. He laid all of it down with the vocabulary of surrender he had learned, with the trust he genuinely felt. And nothing moved. Not dramatically. Not the way doubt moves in stories. The ceiling did not slam shut, and the word did not lose its power, and he did not stop believing. He simply adjusted, quietly. The way a person unconsciously adjusts their posture after enough hours in an uncomfortable chair. He stopped praying for specific things. He prayed in generalities instead, kept things vague, kept expectations low, so there was nothing concrete enough to be disappointed by. He went to church and sang the songs and listened to the sermons. He knew his Bible. He was still, by any reasonable measure, a man of faith. But the journal had run out of pages 4 years ago, and he had never bought another one. And no one around him could see it. That was the other thing. From the outside, Ethan looked fine. He helped at church occasionally. He was kind to people. He answered texts and showed up for birthdays and gave thoughtful gifts and said the right things in the right moments. But inside, in the place where the prayers used to rise like something living, there was now a vast and terrible ordinariness. Not pain, not anger, just nothing advancing. Just the long, flat horizon of a life that believed in God but had stopped expecting him to do much with it. He was 34, and he was still. And on this particular Tuesday, walking to the train with his hands in his pockets and his breath misting faintly in the cool morning air, Ethan did not know that by the time he walked back through his apartment door that evening, something would be different. Not around him, not in the visible geography of his circumstances, but in the room where the fire used to be. The thing about a faith that has gone quiet is that it is almost impossible to diagnose from the inside. You can name it from the outside. A pastor can see it sometimes. That particular expression during worship, the eyes that watch instead of close, the smile that arrives a half-beat too late during announcements. But from the inside, it feels like nothing except normalcy. You still believe. You still show up. You still know the words. And because you know the words, you use them. And because you use them, you can convince yourself that the engine is still running, that the silence is just a season, that God is always faithful, that he who began a good work will carry it to completion. Ethan had told himself all of these things. He had told them to himself on Sunday mornings when the worship music moved something in the room, and he stood a little apart from it, watching. He had told them to himself during small group conversations when the others spoke about what God was doing in their lives. Promotions and pregnancies and answered prayers and open doors. And he had nodded and smiled because he believed them and was genuinely glad for them, and did not understand why none of it seemed to be the texture of his own story. He had told them to himself on the nights when the apartment was very quiet and the city hummed outside, and he sat with his phone face down and tried to pray, but the words felt like they ended 2 feet above his head. Those nights were the hardest, and not for the reason you might think. They were hard because they produced no crisis. There was no wrestling match, no dark night of visible anguish, nothing that would look compelling in a testimony. There was only the quiet and the ceiling and the awareness that this was now the ambient condition of his life. Not torment, not crisis, just an ordinary flatness that he had long since stopped expecting to break. He had prayed about it once, directly. One night about a year ago, he had sat on the edge of his bed and said, out loud, in the way that feels simultaneously sincere and slightly absurd when the room is empty, God, I don't know what's happening. I still believe you are real. I still believe you are good, but I feel like I've been standing in the same place for so long that the ground has grown into my feet. I don't know if I'm waiting for you or if you're waiting for me or if we've both simply gotten used to this." He paused after saying that. Nothing answered. The city went on outside. A siren passed in the distance and faded. The refrigerator hummed. He went to bed. And the Tuesday mornings kept coming. What no one tells you about spiritual stagnation is how thoroughly it colonizes the ordinary. It doesn't just affect your prayers. It settles into the commute, into the way you scroll through your phone, into the faint background radiation of every decision that feels small enough that it probably doesn't matter anyway. Ethan began to notice it in his choices. The way he stopped applying for new positions because the expectation had become more painful than the routine. The way he declined certain invitations not because he didn't want to go, but because the version of himself that used to want things with enthusiasm had gone somewhere he couldn't locate. He was not depressed. He was not in despair. He was something harder to treat and harder to name. He was a man who had decided, without ever consciously deciding, that he was not the kind of person things happened to. That God was good and real and active, just apparently active in other directions. That the appropriate response to this was a dignified and largely painless adjustment of expectation. He had friends who would have disagreed if he had told them. His friend Marcus, who he had known since college and who had a directness that Ethan alternately appreciated and found exhausting, would have looked at him across a table and said something honest and inconvenient. His mother would have prayed with him and believed something would shift. The pastor at his church was the kind of man whose faith was contagious when you were near it, though you could lose the feeling on the train ride home. But Ethan didn't tell any of them because it didn't feel like the kind of thing you say out loud when you can't point to a wound. When the problem is not that something is broken, but that nothing is moving. When the emergency is quiet and looks, from the outside, entirely like peace. He carried it the way you carry something too diffuse to put down, in the posture of his shoulders, in the narrowing of his expectations, in the particular way he read scriptures about promise and provision with a kind of admiring detachment, the way you admire a painting of a landscape you do not expect to visit. That Tuesday he ate lunch alone at his desk. He ate the same thing he ate most Tuesdays, a sandwich from the place downstairs, a water, an apple he didn't always finish. He read something on his phone while he ate, the way he usually did, not quite registering it. The afternoon passed with the speed that only entirely forgettable afternoons have, quick and total, a block of hours that left no impression. At 5:30 he packed up and walked to the elevator. He passed an older colleague on the way out, a man named Philip who worked in the back office and whom Ethan knew only vaguely. Philip was somewhere in his 60s, unhurried in the particular way that people become when they have outlasted enough urgencies, with a broad, calm face and a habit of pausing before he spoke that some people found slow, and Ethan had always found, without quite knowing why, quietly reassuring. "Good evening," Philip said. "Evening," Ethan said. They rode the elevator together. Philip looked at the floor numbers. Ethan looked at his phone. Just before the lobby, Philip said without apparent preamble, without looking at him, "You know what I've noticed about waiting?" Ethan looked up. "Most people," Philip said, still watching the numbers, "think waiting means standing still. But seeds wait, and they're not still at all." The doors opened. Philip walked out first. He did not say anything else. He crossed the lobby with the same unhurried pace, pushed through the glass door and was gone into the street. Ethan stood in the elevator. The doors began to close. He put out a hand and stopped them, stepped out, and stood in the lobby for a moment longer than he needed to. Most people wait for burning bushes, and I understand why. The burning bush is a satisfying story. There is fire, and there is voice, and there is a direct divine address. Take off your shoes, this is holy ground. You know exactly what happened and when it happened and what it meant. You could write the date in your journal and never question it. But I have come to believe that for most of us, for the Ethans of this world, the ones carrying a quiet faith in a small apartment in a city that doesn't slow down, God does not primarily speak in burning bushes. He speaks in the sentence from the unremarkable man in the elevator. He speaks in the thing that you hear and cannot stop thinking about on the 6-minute walk to the train. Seeds wait, and they are not still at all. Ethan walked to the train station with those words sitting in his chest. He had heard things like that before. He had read things like that before. Inspirational language was everywhere, on calendars, in sermon illustrations, in the captions beneath photographs of mountains on the accounts he sometimes followed. He knew how to receive a good sentence and feel something briefly and let it fade on the commute home. He knew how to be moved without being changed. But something was different about this one. Not the words themselves, it was the way they had arrived, unprompted, unasked for, from a man who could not have known what Ethan was carrying, from a mouth that had opened without invitation in a closing elevator and said the precise thing that Ethan had never thought to ask for. He thought about seeds on the train. He thought about how a seed in the ground looks, to any observer, like nothing, like absence, like the ground simply closed over something and the something disappeared. How if you were watching the garden in January, you would have no evidence of what was happening, no movement, no light, no indication of process, only the stillness of soil that gives nothing away. He thought about how he had been watching his own life the way you watch soil in January, measuring it by surface, by what he could see, by the silence of what had not yet broken through. He got off at his stop, walked the 4 blocks home. The city was doing its evening thing. Lights coming on, people moving, the smell of food from the Thai place on the corner, the sound of a child being called indoors. He walked through it differently than he had walked out that morning. Not faster, not with any particular resolution, just differently, the way you walk when something has been slightly rearranged in the interior. He unlocked his apartment, put his keys on the hook, stood in the kitchen. The coffee mug from that morning was still on the counter, cold, forgotten. He didn't pour it out right away. He stood there looking at it. And in that moment, this is the part I need you to understand, in that moment something happened that had no sound and no light and no dramatic score. It was not a vision. It was not a voice from heaven. It was something quieter and in some ways more astonishing. It was the simple, sudden, unforced awareness that God had been present the entire time. Not distant, not withheld, present. Present in the 8 years of the same apartment and the same commute and the prayers that felt like they ended 2 feet above his head. Present in the Tuesday mornings and the cooling coffee and the unanswered journal entries and the songs he had sung without feeling them. Present in the closed doors and the disappointments and the long plateau of ordinariness that he had quietly decided was the shape of his life. Not waiting for him to become something worth visiting, already there. Ethan sat down on the kitchen floor, not dramatically, not weeping, not overcome. He just sat down because standing no longer felt like the right posture for what was happening. He put his back against the cabinet and looked at the ceiling and breathed. And he thought, what if waiting on God is not the same as waiting for God? What if the whole architecture of his thinking had been built on a small, silent error? The idea that waiting was passive, that it was the holding of breath until something arrived, that the waiting itself was emptiness to be endured. What if waiting on God was something else entirely? A posture, not a pause. An orientation, not an absence. The way a servant waits on a household, not frozen, not idle, but attending. Present, available. Watching not for the waiting to end, but for the one they are waiting on. He had spent 8 years waiting for God to do something. What if God had been waiting for him to stop measuring the soil? The kitchen was very quiet. He became aware gradually of things he had stopped noticing. The way the evening light came through the window at this hour, gold and specific, landing on the corner of the counter in a stripe he must have seen 1,000 times. The sound of his own breathing, slower now. The weight of his body against the cabinet. Small, ordinary things. The kind of things that are always present and almost never seen. He thought about the past 8 years. And he thought about them differently than he had ever thought about them before. Not as years of waiting in the dark, as years of preparation he could not see because preparation never announces itself. The friendships that had shaped him in ways he hadn't cataloged. The disciplines that had built something in him even when they felt empty. The repeated surrender of expectations that had done something to his pride, had worn something away slowly the way water wears stone, without the stone knowing it is being formed. He had thought the silence was God's absence. What if it had been God's workshop? He didn't have a neat answer to that. He didn't suddenly understand why the specific doors had closed, or what the specific plan was, or when the visible movement would begin. He was not transported from his kitchen floor to a different life. He still had the same job, the same apartment, the same Tuesday. But something had shifted in the way he was holding all of it. And that shift, small, interior, entirely invisible to any observer, was the most significant thing that had happened to Ethan in 8 years. He made fresh coffee. Not because that detail is spiritually significant, but because it was the first thing he did. He poured out the cold cup, rinsed it, made a new pot, and stood at the counter while it brewed. And if you had been watching him from across the room, you might not have seen any difference in the man standing there. Same apartment, same height, same face. But the man standing at that counter was not identical to the man who had left that morning. Something had been reordered. Something had been given back. He found the old dark blue journal that evening. It was in the bottom drawer of the desk in his bedroom, under a phone charger and a foreign coin, and the program from a conference he had attended 3 years ago. He sat at the desk with it in his hands for a while. He didn't open it right away. He just held it, feeling the weight of it, the spiral binding, the slightly warped cover from an old water ring on the corner. Then he opened it. He read some of what he had written in those early years, the 26-year-old version of himself, specific and expectant and sometimes embarrassingly earnest. He read about the job he had prayed for and not received, about the relationship, about the direction he had asked for in different shapes across different years. And reading it now from the kitchen floor of 34, he saw something he had not been able to see from inside those years. He saw that he had not been abandoned. He saw that in the space around each unmet request, things had happened. Not the things he had asked for, but things. Growth he hadn't tracked because it wasn't the growth he was watching for. A character formed by the specific friction of his specific life. A patience he had built without knowing he was building it. An empathy for the overlooked that had come directly from his own years of feeling overlooked. A quietness that might once have looked to him like deadness, but was, he now suspected, the kind of stillness from which certain things grow. He had been asking God to open a door. God had been building a man who could walk through one. He got a new journal 3 days later. A simple one, brown cover, lined pages. He sat down with it on Thursday evening, which was not Tuesday and was not Monday, just another ordinary weekday. And he wrote the date at the top of the first page. And then, underneath it, he wrote one line that was not a request, and not a praise report, and not a spiritual inventory. He wrote, "I think I have been misunderstanding what waiting means." And then he kept writing, not with the certainty of someone who has received an answer, with the honesty of someone who has received a shift in perspective, which is not the same thing as an answer, and is sometimes better. He wrote about the seeds, about Philip, whose last name he did not know and whom he passed in the hallway twice more that week without the man saying anything particular or significant. Because that is how God so often works, passing you a word you needed through a hand that doesn't know it's carrying anything. He wrote about the years of quiet. He wrote about how he wanted to be a man who waited well, not passively, not with the dull resignation he had confused for surrender, but with the active, attentive posture of someone who trusted the one they were waiting on. The way a gardener tends soil in January, not because they can see anything happening, but because they know what January is for. In the weeks that followed, certain things began to move, slowly, without spectacle. A conversation with a former colleague that opened an unexpected door he hadn't known to knock on. A call from his mother that led to an honest conversation about his faith. The first such conversation in years, that left both of them changed in quiet ways. A Sunday at church where the music did something in him again, not the overwhelming flood of his younger years, but something more seasoned, more knowing, the difference between a first rain and a deep well. He could not have manufactured any of it. He had not figured out the mechanism or unlocked the right prayer formula, or discovered the spiritual key that had been missing. He had simply gotten up off the floor of his kitchen and made fresh coffee and opened a drawer and found his journal, and begun for the first time in a very long time to wait on God rather than for him. The difference, he was learning, was everything. I'll tell you what I believe about you. I believe some of you have been standing in the same place for a long time, and the standing has started to feel like evidence that something is wrong, that God has forgotten you or moved on, or that you have been quietly disqualified from the kind of story where things happen. I want to tell you what I told Ethan. The soil in January is not empty. The season you are in is not punishment. The silence is not the silence of a God who has nothing to say. It is, sometimes, the silence of a God who is building something in you that requires exactly this time, this pressure, this particular waiting. You have not been left behind. You have been trusted with a winter. And I know winter is long. And I know the ground gives nothing away. But if you will turn your waiting into attending, if you will exchange the passive counting of days for the active posture of someone who trusts the one they are waiting on, then I promise you this: you will begin to see what the soil has been doing. The roots go deep before the branch goes up. That is not a disappointment. That is the faithfulness of God. Wait on Him, not for Him, on Him. He knows exactly what you need, and He has never, not for a single day of your stillness, stopped working. This is a fictional narrative of Christian inspiration. All images and video used to illustrate this story were created with artificial intelligence for the purposes of edification and encouragement.